Hey guys, Nirvana here for a very cool video that I came up with. I saw a thread on Doomworld and it was basically talking about thing placement and maps, and there was a lot of people saying uh, that it was their most despised part of, of making maps. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Um, I think a lot of it has to do with the way people approach encounter design in Doom and thing placement in general, and the whole concept of thing placement. So I wanted to make a video sort of discussing uh, some of the elements of encounter design, maybe that people haven't thought of, things that I utilize a lot, and maybe talk about why I think some people have issues with it uh, towards the end of the video. So I want to talk about building an arena around a preconceived combat idea. So this is an arena that you have done a lot of pre-planning for. You know thing placement, you know the gimmick for the encounter if there is one, that kind of thing. Like totally planned out uh, area or arena or what have you. Then building an area and creating encounter concepts as you go. So that means like you're doing some free flow mapping, but as you're going, you're like, okay, I want to mank here because I'm going to build a little perch. So, you know, you build some elevated sections, you put some monster closest to the wall, you're like, I'm going to have a couple of remnants coming out of here. So you're thinking about thing placement as you go. And then building an arena and fitting an encounter into it after the fact. Now, I think this is where people mess up. I think this is the most common way of building Doom maps, and I also think it's maybe not the worst, but definitely the most difficult way to make interesting combat. And I will talk about that later in the sort of benefits, pros and cons, etc. of that. I also want to talk about building an arena with a heavy gimmick, which I'll get into in a second. Incidental versus arena combat, I will touch on just the definitions and what's different about making encounters for it. General thoughts on monster placement, and then taking an existing fight idea and iterating on it, which I did that a couple of times in Fractured Worlds where I had fights that I thought were interesting from other WODs, and I took them, like the basic concepts of them, and I put them in and put like my own spin on it, kind of thing. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, let me get started. Fracture Worlds Map 3 on Electric Winds. This is a preconceived combat arena. So Blue Key Arena involves a gimmick where the floor is changed from a paint sector to a non-damaging floor via switch press on a timer. So people would know this fight if they played the WOD, obviously. The way it functions is, let me just open up Doom Builder, make sure I actually transition. So this is the arena. You start up here, you drop down, this damages you, and then if you press this switch, the floor will change to red, so it'll be blood floor. These waterfalls too, which are your visual indicator for the timer. Um, and it will no longer damage you. So it damages you when you enter. If you press the switch, it doesn't, and then that's on a timer. And once the timer runs out, it goes back to damaging you. So it's constant management of this switch throughout the fight. That's the basic gimmick. So what are the benefits of building an encounter with a preconceived combat? A preconceived idea about the combat. So I think this is the best way to build encounters in Doom, for the most part, with some caveats. It allows you to build geometry with purpose, for one thing, which means that your design decisions are actually thought out. Like, it means that you can structure your geometry around your monsters because you know what monsters you want to use for the fight, and it puts combat at the forefront instead of visuals, which means gameplay-wise, it tends to be the strongest. This is generally how you're going to get the best out of your monsters when you place them into arenas. If you already have pre-planned how you want the fight to go. Because, yeah, geometry is constructed with combat in mind, generally allows for more interesting player movement and more focused set pieces. This includes stopping easy circle stroke patterns, etc. So, big problem I see with new mappers coming in and making slaughter stuff. Lots of big open spaces, often circular rooms, often large square rooms, without geometry that breaks up the flow, which means in Doom, because of the way the monster AI works, if I'm running around in a circle in a big open space, the monsters will eventually, they try to run in a straight line towards you, and they eventually end up spinning, essentially. So if you run around in a circle, you could just hold mobs in the center of a room. Everyone knows this realistically. And it means that, it trivializes combat, and it also makes the movement in combat just not very interesting to partake in. This sort of thing, pre-planning uh, arenas, also helps to create good flow for maps. So you can assess the player's routing through areas before fully building geometry. So routing is incredibly important. Where the player starts in a room has a big impact on how the combat flows. I'll talk about that a bit later when I have some other examples. But if you have pre-planned geometry for an encounter, it really means that you can assess where the player starts, where they're going to want to move to, and how they're going to want to move around the room after that point. The detriments to this, it's less free-flowing than other ways of mapping. So if you're pre-planning everything, obviously you don't have that sort of natural organic flow when you're mapping or building stuff, and some people really excel in mapping that way, and you can kind of see it in the way the maps are put together, often in speed map scenarios. And by that same token, it's a lot slower pre-planning everything, which is one of the main reasons why I don't pre-plan every single encounter that I make, and I try to mix and match the way that I map in order to speed up the process, as well as for some other reasons. But yeah, I would say that's definitely a big one. So, when we're thinking about the actual encounter, I'll probably head back into Doom Builder for this. So, this is also in terms of the gimmick itself. What needs to happen to make this fight work correctly? And this is sort of the stuff that you need to think about when you're first designing an encounter, like the very beginnings of constructing it. So, I have my gimmick in mind. I have a basic idea of the arena, what enemies I want to use, etc. So, how do I enforce this gimmick? How do I make this gimmick work? First thing I need to do is create like initial pressure. So you're in the slime boom, it's damaging. You need to assess like, because the player's here, right? These lower, there are imps TPing in at an alarming rate. So this space is starting to get filled up really quickly. This is your safe space because this damages you. The player wants to be here. So as soon as the player drops in, it's like, shit, I need to look for the safest possible place to be. That is the first thought, even if a player isn't thinking that they're going to try to make. They're going to push into this because it doesn't damage you. And the imps are here. So the imps are filling up the space. Slowly the space is becoming less and less safe. The cybers are perched here in order to make this space even less safe. So they're raining down hell while you're in here trying to push through imps with the rocket launcher. And the whole reason for this, the reason these imps are here, the reason the cyber demons are here is to make this area not as safe as this area to be in, which will force the player to utilize this switch, which makes this into a non-damaging floor. So really all of these monsters are here just to force the player to use this gimmick that I've sort of painstakingly put together, right? Which which sort of takes me to the next idea, which is so how should it be constructed and in what order? Now the order is kind of important here. So um, because this is like quite a gimmicky fight, like the whole fight is centered around this main gimmick. Um, it means that I had to spend quite a lot of time before I could begin with thing placement, actually constructing the arena, doing anything. I had to do uh, a decent amount of work just building voodoo stuff. I had to work out this voodoo timer, which required a lot of messing around, not only because I had to get the timing correct for, how long I wanted the floor to be damaging for, and etc. But there's a visual component to this fight where this raises. This is your timer. I'll just do this manually because I don't want to go into the game because of OBS capturing shenanigans. But basically this raises up slowly and then lowers down slowly. And this is used as a visual indicator of the gimmick in the fight so that as I'm running around, I can hear and see, okay, shit, the floor is about to change. I need to get back over to the switch and I need to press it again. Otherwise I'm going to take a bunch of damage. And on top of that, during testing, some people, and Callaghan specifically, pointed out that it would be great to have a visual indicator before you enter the fight to let the player know how this gimmick actually works, because to begin with, you were just dropped straight into the slime, and it was damaging you, and you had to run around. And I was like, well, this will create enough pressure that the player will go and hit the switch and like figure it out on their own, kind of thing. Because really, I do want players to like try to figure out these fights on their own and like use their brain and stuff. That is kind of a big part of like my mapping style, is that I want the player to try things out in order to win. But it did feel a little bit unfair. I guess you were taking a lot of tick damage on your first attempts, just sort of figuring stuff out. So I ended up making the switch, uh, and it basically, like, when you press it, it will change the floor initially. So you can press it. These will you know it'll have the same sort of visual cue as the ones there. It rises up and it's got the red. It's got the blood so that you know that it doesn't damage you. And then you come down here and you're like, oh shit, this floor changed, and when I'm on it, it doesn't damage me. I wonder why the floor changed. So we introduce the gimmick that way. Then you're gonna see this start to lower. It's like, oh, something's about to change with the floor, and then boom, it damages you. Now you've seen this switch up here. It's an identical switch, and you're like, okay, well this probably does the same thing as the other one. So I'm giving the player as much information to work with as possible, uh, because you don't really you don't want your player to be complaining that it's unfair. Essentially, I learned sort of a lot from playing Rubik's stuff about visual indicators before fights. Giving the player as much information to work with as possible is really good, because um, it basically allows them to make intelligent decisions when the fight begins. So it's not just purely reactionary gameplay. You can sort of make your encounters a little bit more cognitive that way by just giving the player a little bit more information. Uh, so let me talk a little bit about how to make like a gimmick work properly in an encounter. So I need a drink. It's a lot of talking. Is this like bad YouTube etiquette to have a big old gulp? Maybe I should I gotta pause the video, go away, edit all the pieces together later, remove all drinking. Uh, but anyway, so enforcing the gimmick, big part of this fight in particular. So in this particular instance, your main threats are the floor, obviously, damages you. In front of you, imps. Now, like I was saying before, the first thing the player wants to do is find the safest space. If you can sit in one place in Doom, it's very good. It's obviously your main goal is to like have to move as little as possible and be as safe as possible. So you want to come in here. Now the imps make it a little bit difficult. The cyber demons make it much more difficult. And this whole thing, the whole reason these imps are on this side, on the safe area, and why the cybers are here in the first place, is to force you to make this space your safe space. So it's to force the player to assess, like, okay, I can't be here. There are too many imps. These cyber rockets are obliterating me. I have to go out here, and I have to hit this switch in order to make this floor safe to stand on. That is the goal here. And so um, initially what I'm doing here is what I'm going to call a soft enforcing of the gimmick. So we start with imps, because you have a rocket launcher at this stage, so you can push through the imps. This entire space here, you can actually stay in this whole space for the first part of the fight. Good players can push through these imps. You can push sort of this way, and then you push your way back with rockets. It's definitely doable. Not ideal, but totally can do it. But most players are going to be geared towards trying out the switch and being like, oh, this is how the gimmick works. Okay, I'm going to utilize it for the fight, which is my goal as a mapper, obviously, is to have that gimmick that I put into the fight utilized. Now, what happens after is you hit these three switches, 1, 2, 3, and then revenants, they teleport into this space, and these cyber demons, they TP down onto the ground. So if you're in here when that happens, which you will be because you have to press the switches, this space starts to fill up very quickly with enemies that are a lot tankier than imps, and there are a lot of them, and they do a lot more damage. And the cyber demons here, they can pincer you through these little gaps that lure. So once again, I'm trying to push the player out of this area and into this area so that they will utilize the switch. And this is what I would call hard enforcing of the gimmick. So um, sometimes you have to decide. Sometimes you can hard enforce right from the beginning with a gimmick. Like it's just like if you don't use this gimmick, you will die no matter what. But other times, and I would say most of the time, it's probably better to start with a soft enforce. So it's like you're guiding the player towards using the gimmick, and then hard enforce after that. So it's like, it's like, okay, now you really have to use the gimmick or you're going to die, kind of thing. That's only if you. Sometimes it's totally okay for the gimmick not to be used and for it to just be an interesting feature of a fight. I think that's totally fine. Um, and there's actually like a little quote that I put on here uh, from Rubik's, which is, I mean, this is a paraphrase really. He told me when we were sort of discussing mapping and things like that, that the more gimmicky a fight is, the easier it should be. It's sort of one of the things that he tries to adhere to when he makes stuff. And I agree for the most part, I would say, for sure. And that's why the most gimmicky fight probably in Fractured Worlds Map 3 is the telefragging Cybers fight, which has a lot of. It's relatively simplistic, but it has a lot of uh, things that the player has to hit. So it's got all these different layers to it. First, you have to telefrag a cyber demon. Then you have to shoot a shoot switch that will block the rockets coming to kill you. And then you have to TP back to get back into the space in order to force the cybers up and telefrag them again. So in that case, I made the fight relatively short and at least fairly simple. Like it's just some cyber demons that you have to deal with. It's not a whole long, drawn out thing because I knew that conceptually it was it required a bit of trial and error, I would say. The player's probably going to die to a stray rocket or something, attempting to figure it out. So when designing gimmicks, definitely erring towards keeping the combat a bit easier if you're going to heavily enforce the gimmick is a good idea. But I think there are definitely instances where you want the gimmick to shine a little bit more than the rest of the combat. At least in my case, that's something I like to do. Okay, so uh, yeah, I suppose that it's just a little introduction or idea about good ways to deal with pre-planned combat ideas and the things you need to think about when you start implementing those ideas. So, um, where are your threats initially? What's the safe space in the area? How do I force the player to move away from that safe space and create their own safe spaces so that the movement is interesting? Um, where are like the pressure zones? So cyber demons creating pressure, imps creating space pressure. Definitely different kinds of pressure in Doom. Um, and all of this is obviously helped by the fact that I already knew what I wanted to do. So having that kind of pre-planned concept is definitely going to help you out in these kinds of complicated, gimmicky fights, certainly. So the next type of encounter design um, that I use anyway is building an area and then creating encounter concepts as you go. So this is the one where you're building an area fairly free flow, and then you're like, okay, I need some monsters in this area, so let me introduce a couple of little pockets where I can place those monsters in, like some closets or some elevated areas or whatever it may be. So we're going to go to map 5 of Fractured Worlds for this, which is solid core. And I'm going to talk about, it's once again the blue key fight in that map. And basically all I had cyber demons in the middle. I knew I wanted them to be released via switches, and probably something to do with, releasing the cyber demons on like either all at once or individually. That was really all I had in terms of the core concept for the fight. But I had the whole arena built, and I built that in. So I'll go over to Doom Builder real quick. So let's have a look. So it's this arena here. So this is the fucking thing, okay? The other concept that I wanted to tackle was circle strafe. So I knew I wanted to make a circular arena, and I wanted to have these cybers in the middle, and I wanted to kind of I call this fight like meditations on circle strafe. That was my concept here. Because I wanted to make a circle strafe fight that was still punishing, even though you were circle strafing. And then I wanted to deal with this cyber demon thing in the center. So these are the 4 cyber demons. This is what I had mainly with these sort of pockets. And these vials got introduced later on. Revenants on other difficulties. But this was the basic thing, right? A big old circle. Now, I could have left this as just a circle and then been like, okay, let me just dump in some enemies after the fact. And I probably wouldn't have had this in the middle because this is kind of the key element of this design, uh, of this like way of mapping that makes it a little bit better than just building a big circle and then filling it in after the fact. So the benefits of this, it's faster than attempting to conceive each encounter individually. So you get a little bit of that free flow. I think it has a nice fusion of the thought out rigid encounter design and free flowing geometry. So it's not like I didn't sit down with pen and paper and like plan the whole thing out, but I was thinking as I went about monsters the whole time. And I will say that even if I'm free flow mapping, like I'm just drawing stuff in the editor just to focus on like aesthetics or whatever. I'm just building a room because it looks nice. I'm still thinking the whole time, okay, I know at the end of this I have to put monsters into this area, even if I'm doing that. So I'll get that out of the way before I talk about that later on. Yeah, what's cool about this is it allows for unique geometric shapes in rooms that allow for interesting movement. Free flow drawing of areas often leads to stranger shapes and more geometric oddities than some pre-planned. Yeah, so this is one of the things I'm talking about when I talk about like free flowing concepts. In this room, it's a fucking circle, so you know, not particularly incredible or unique geometry there. But you know, there are certain scenarios where you end up with very strange shapes just because you were clicking vertices and connecting lines and stuff, and then the space can take on some interesting shapes, and that can actually lead to interesting encounter design by virtue of the fact that you're trying to fit monsters into these awkwardly constructed areas. Sorry, I have to take another drink. I'm out of breath. Okay, the other thing I really like about this is that it has like a real natural feeling of it. Because monsters being built into the space, often one of the problems that I see, again, in Slaughter stuff, and probably, I suppose, GZ stuff specifically as well, this is usually due to ACS being a way to sort of bring monsters into spaces very easily, so a lot of new mappers tend to utilize it. You don't get that natural organic feeling that the monsters inhabit the space in any way. Like, if you're building stuff into an arena, you know, lowering walls, things like that, you get that sense that there's some level of kind of construction to the area, and you can kind of feel the bricks and mortar of the place a little bit more if you're actually building monsters into the space. And it also adds like, you know, levels of spectacle and aesthetic appeal to areas. I'll just quickly actually let me open up map 4 real quick because this is sort of my probably the best example of this that I worked with in Fractured Worlds. But this fight in particular, okay, you can't really see because of the giant fucking 242. But this area, there's a big old pyramid here of Hell Knights and Barons, and you walk into the space. So there's this big visual spectacle. This is a big lighting sequence. These guys are all lighting up in like a sequence, and then the back wall lights. So you have this big visual spectacle, and instead of just teleporting the monsters in from an outside area, you watch them lower down. Each individual layer lowers, and then they TP from this pit up to here. So the the TP mechanism is actually built into the space, and you get to watch it occurring, and it becomes part of the aesthetic of the fight, kind of thing. Which can really help, I think, to make, you know, like a big encounter memorable and interesting, for sure. But back to my cool slideshow. Detriments of this, it can make constructing areas jarring if building a monster closes string mapping isn't something you're used to. Yeah. So this comes back to, you know, what you're used to working with. It might make you stop and start a lot, I suppose, is what I mean by jarring. Like it might make you go, oh shit, I need to like think about how to put a monster into this area. Because maybe it's not something you're used to actually thinking about. So that, I suppose that can sort of slow down your process a little bit. And then, you know, it's not as structured and not as free flowing. So this thing that's a positive could also be a negative because, you know, it obviously sits in between. So it's sort of, it's worse at both things than the other two. But, you know, it's striking a bit more of a balance. So what kind of stuff should you be looking to create specifically? Like, why is this beneficial in the first place to utilize this style over another style? Uh, First of all, like you get because it's the best of both worlds, right? You get that free flowing element where you can just build a bunch of shit. I can just build this dumb circular room, but then you also end up with these like little fundamentals. So you end up with like some loose concepts to work with. So it makes your building process easier because it's faster, and then it makes your post process, like the thing placement and encounter design of the area, easier as well because now you've got some initial foundations built in. So that can be really nice. So this was really the initial concepts. Is I knew I wanted some circle strafe, some cyber demons, uh, and yeah, when thinking about this, think about the monsters as sort of the main thing to build around. So because I have this in the center of the room, easy to kind of build everything around it. Um, but it means like, I know I have monsters in the room. I need some level of cover, some of this stuff, the way this circle strafe is split is sort of very deliberate so that there's some more interesting movement and lines of sight. It's not just, I'm not just running around the room in a circle, but there are different lines of sight. These gaps are also uh, sort of structured in ways where you have to be careful not to get into like just a loop of circle strafing with the vials because you're running around this wall, and then all of a sudden there's a gap and they have line of sight of you. So there's at least some stop and start to your circle strafe, and I mean, uh, there are monsters teleporting in, which came in later because I have this base uh, cyber demons at the center. I can work from this, and then the concept kind of built itself. It was like, okay, well, cyber demons in the middle, I got quite a large open area. I know I got these gaps. This makes for interesting line of sight for vials. Vials can infight with these cybers. These are the baby ones as well that are used in Fractured Worlds, so they have 2k health. Or is it? No, sorry, 1k health. And so the concept kind of slowly started to build itself from that initial foundation of now I can utilize infighting with the vials. So now it's like, okay, hit the switch. This lowers. You've got a cyber demon and a bunch of vials. I can get them infighting. Uh, and then it becomes like this process of the player slowly working around, having to pick off the vials. Do I let them kill the cyber? Do I want to help the cyber so that he kills the vials, and then I can stack this cyber demon so I have two cyber demons for the next wave of arch vials to help kill them faster. Uh, and then do I want to hit all the switches at once and just have a clusterfuck in the middle and hope that the cyber demons come out on top? You could do that. And the thing is, once I started to have these ideas from that initial foundation, then it was like, okay, how do I break up this circle strafe around the outside? Okay, well, monsters blocking your movement. Now you have monsters here and monsters here because I need to block both sides, so you can't just do a U strafe and then pull them into the center. So then your goal becomes, how do I pull everything into the middle and have it infight with the Cyberdemons? And should I activate everything at once because then this whole outside area is going to fill up? Suddenly, cognitively, the fight becomes a lot more interesting. Movement-wise, it becomes a lot more interesting because there's some need to duck through these areas now. There's some need to pull monsters, stand in this area, pull these monsters maybe, and then uh, dip through kind of thing. And you've got these infighting elements. Slowly, you're sort of building something a bit more interesting than just a circular arena, right? And all of that comes back to having thought initially about uh, just a couple of monsters in the middle. I was like, okay, I know I want some monsters in this fight, obviously. I need to implement that into my building process. So that's sort of one of the big benefits of building stuff this way. And really about thinking about monster placement as early as possible in your process. In maybe not particularly in this case, but in other ones, because this arena is like quite simplistic and stuff. But when you're thinking about flow and movement through space, this is probably particularly applicable to sort of more incidental combat. And just thinking about how monsters are going to move through the space. Okay, well that part of it is important for everything. But yeah, if you're implementing these monster closets, elevated segments, things like that for monsters early, it's really going to help you think about how the player is going to move through those areas. It's also going to help you, like, okay, say without thinking about it at all, I build this area, and you can't actually tell, but this is 2-4-2, so this is actually like a staggered staircase effect. If I had left this as a staircase without thinking about monsters because it looked cool, monsters wouldn't be able to walk through this area. And then the player would just be able to go down here, right? And the monsters would be stuck either side. But instead, I was like, okay, well, I know monsters are going to be walking around this space. I know monsters can't handle small, steep staircases like this. So I'm going to have to 2-4-2 this. As in put a fake floor, if people are familiar with the term. So I have to put a fake floor over the top of it to make sure that the monsters can actually move around the space and follow the player as much as possible. Because Doom's AI is built around following the player. So your goal when making encounters should be to allow the monsters to follow the player as much as possible. As a basic rule, obviously, if you have very specific ideas in mind, that's not necessarily going to be true. But this is like a big reason why you want to think about monster placement as early as possible, because uh, things like stairs, elevated areas, stuff like that, anything that breaks up movement in an area is really going to mess with how the monsters move around the space and how the player is able to pull the monsters around the space and stuff like that. Yeah. So yeah, this way of monster design is, like I was saying, can work really well for incidental gameplay. Like Tomahawk, which is map 1 of Fractured Worlds. So pretty much all of Tomahawk was built this way. Pretty much this whole map was built just around the concept of like completely free flowing, except I'm implementing monster placement as early as possible. Like I'm thinking about it as early as possible. So this bank that raises out of the ground, I knew I wanted this bank here straight away. The flow of the map was kind of built just by, I'm just putting shapes together. But as I'm building these shapes, I'm like, okay, I want these pillars to have monsters in them. I know that for a fact. And then this leads to like this whole concept of, because I built these pillars in this room, they were just pillars initially, and then I was like, okay, I could fit monsters in those pillars. I could fit vials because they fit very nicely in small areas. This leads to basically the entirety of the flow of the map, because then it's like I have 3 vials. I know I want to give the player like weapons throughout the map, and then I can tie these weapons to releasing these vials individually. So you pick up SSG, vial, pick up rocket launcher, vial comes out. and then that sort of helps build the flow of the map already. Like the pace of the map, the difficulty of the map, all these things is just because this is the mapping style that I decided to utilize for this. And I think that's one of the reasons it's definitely a great mix of speed and actual thought and process. So yeah, definitely something to consider if you're struggling with just building maps and then oh shit, I have to do thing placement right at the end. Even just having some sort of slight ideas at the beginning can really spark a lot later on. Yeah, etc. Blah blah blah. Okay, so this is the last one. Building an area and encounter, an area and creating encounter concepts as you go. So this is what I've been bitching about this whole time, but I do it occasionally with some caveats to it. So the Purple Key Arena in Map 2 was constructed for aesthetics, and then combat was thought up after the fact. Once again, like I said, I do always think about combat. I know monsters have to be in the space, so I'm attempting to build in interesting geometry for movement and gameplay, even if I'm building it uh, for aesthetics essentially. But yeah, so benefits of building an encounter this way. Talk about the good parts. You can see Detriments has a lot because obviously this is the one I think people make the most mistakes with, but here we go. Okay, generally the fastest way to map. Uh, Speed mapping obviously is generally kind of built around this whole concept of just free flowing, draw lines. Although speed mapping not necessarily about aesthetics, obviously, more about just getting maps out as quickly as possible. It can lead to unique rooms, shape designs, etc. Because you're only considering aesthetics. This is also true. You can sort of end up with interesting combat by virtue of the fact that you have to fit it in afterwards. That can definitely happen. Yeah, main way to speed map. Free-flowing ideas, layouts that come together quickly, often in unique ways. So some positives there for sure. Now detriments. This is the most difficult way to get good concepts out of. Without thinking about how monsters will move around a space and control certain areas, it's usually challenging to create interesting encounters. Talked about the benefits a little bit. It also, yeah, it requires a lot of thought after the fact is another big problem. It speeds up your process in terms of your building the geometry quicker, but a lot of the time, all you're doing is sort of delaying the painstaking part of the process to thing placement instead, which is why so many people I think hate thing placement when they're mapping in Doom. Because really, they've sped up their process beforehand, and then the slow part comes afterwards. And the thing placement, in my opinion, that should be the fun part, realistically. Uh, and in this vein, it can require like a ton of tweaking. So yeah, any time saved on geometry is just wasted later on the monster placement. Leads to people hating thing placement, which I also talked about, because they often just don't have fixed ideas and encounters, struggle to force monsters into spaces that weren't designed for them. Yeah, I think it also probably gives you some bad ideas about the function of monsters in spaces. Arch files and stuff, for instance, it's like you're trying to fitting arch files into an encounter after the whole area has already been designed is usually a terrible way to put them in. Even if you're like, well, there's a pillar in the room, um, because you know arch files function pretty well when there are some sort of elements and restrictions to the arena. Uh, yeah, it can limit monster placement is another big problem. So if you build like a really cool elevated area with a lot of pits, uh, it's like a huge environment. There's like pits everywhere, thin platforming, whatever the case. you can only use flying monsters in that encounter, basically, because other monsters aren't going to be able to move around and pressure the player at all. So by building stuff without thinking about monster placement in mind, you can often like limit what kind of monsters you can actually use. Also, in terms of like just heights, floor heights, stairs. You know, pinkies can't get down certain flights of stairs, so shit, I can't use pinkies because I put in like a flight of stairs. It's really awkward for them. Cyber demons are 110 height, and it's like, okay, I made this space 90 for whatever reason because it looked cool aesthetically. Now I can't have a cyber demon in the fight, even though it would really work well given the space or whatever. So yeah, lots of problems. Okay, so what do you do with a space that you haven't built for combat? How do you kind of rectify the decisions? Okay, so let's take a look at what is it, map 2? Let's take a look at this space a little bit, and we'll talk about it a bit. So yeah, this is the space, basically a box. You know, nothing too spectacular about sort of the outer wall geometry and such. And this is what I had to work with. So, the first thing you want to do is assess what aspects of the space are interesting. What have you built in the area that's interesting gameplay-wise? So, the bridge in the arena splits the fight up, and it also gives a little bit of rudimentary line of sight blocking. So, you can block some fireballs with it. Archviles, you might be able to take 20 damage instead of the max damage from that line of sight blocking. So, you know, something there to utilize in an encounter. The entrance to the arena here, this is elevated. So that's something interesting about the arena. It's 32 high because I needed to drop the player in and not have them get out so that I could sort of lock them in the arena. So there you go. There's something interesting about the area to utilize for monster placement. Now here's where I thought about monster placement a little bit. These teleporters are placed semi-deliberately, right? Those were put in like during construction. So we have those teleporters. We know where the monsters are going to come in. Obviously, those can be moved after the fact anyway. Now, I'd say the easiest way to begin thinking about interesting combat in an area that has not been designed for combat is to think about the player's position when the fight starts. So this is something you can control, right? Because sometimes you will put a switch in automatically. Here it's kind of a movable switch. I could put this anywhere because it's on a little block. Sometimes you have it indented into a wall. Maybe that's your only fucking wall in the arena that can fit a switch because you didn't plan for any of it. And in that case, it might be a little bit more difficult. But where the player is when the fight starts is fundamental to how the combat's going to flow. So he starts here at this switch. Boom. Now I have a starting point. Now I know, like now I can think about in the space, where's the player going to want to move to? Where are the pressure points? Where's the safest place? How are the monsters going to move around the arena? Now, this is really important. So we have these teleporters here and here. The player starts here. The monsters are going to move towards him, right? You have a rocket launcher for this fight. Safest place is probably going to be in this area because this space is starting to fill here. This space is starting to fill here. So this is like your safe space in the arena initially. So I was like, okay, you have rocket launcher. It's kind of an open space. I want to create like a pressure fight. Like I want the player to feel like they're on a DPS timer almost. So good monsters for that. Hell Knights and Barons because they move slowly, but they tank quite a lot of hits, and Splash is kind of effective against them. So now I have this pressure coming. This is the safe space. But if I just have Hell Knights and Barons here, right? The player can just stand here. This is the safest place to be in the arena currently, because the monsters are occupying the space here and here, but not here. So this is the absolute safest place to be. This means I need to force the player to move from this safe place somehow. So what's the interesting part of this room? The elevated area. So I put a vial up here. Now there's a purged vial. He's not going to run towards me to make it easy for me to kill him. He's going to stay up here. He teleports in right at the beginning. That's the safest time to kill him before the space is filled up. So I hit the switch, Vial teleports in. This tells the player, okay, I got shit TPing here and here. This space is going to fill up. I need to kill this Vial quickly. So now what happens is, this is where the player wants to go. You want to kill this Vial as quickly as possible, so you move the player from their safe area into an unsafe area. Now you're over here, you've killed this Vial. It's given time for these teleporters to poop out Hell Knights and Barons. And now the player's in like decision mode, which is like the interesting part of combat, right? Now I have to make a decision. I'm over here in an unsafe area. Now I got to do some movement. I got to get back to my safe area. And then you're shooting from here, but this area is getting less and less safe because these guys have had time to TP in, right? So automatically now, with these two concepts about the fight, way more interesting combat than just having the Hell Knights coming in, right? Just having a random group of monsters teleport in. Like I could just be like, okay, well, let's have Revenants and Hell Knights and Cacodemons teleport in. I just pick a random selection and make them TP in. Because I've actually, because I'm taking some time, even if it's after the fact, to think about the space and how monsters are going to move around the space, how the player wants to move around the space, these sorts of things when designing the encounter. Automatically, the fight's going to be a lot more interesting. So, uh, so then, uh, this sort of brings me to the next point, which is what purpose does each monster type have in an arena? This sort of applies to, uh, everything, right? Every encounter you're thinking about at any given time. So I talked about the Vial and the Hell Knights. And then in this fight also, Cyberdemons TP later on, and they serve a dual purpose. So the Vial's purpose, pressure the player to move out of the safest place, and to kill this Vial at the beginning. Barons and HKs, they're your main source of pressure, your general pressure, space pressure for the fight. The Vial is high damage, and he's promoting more interesting movement around the area. Then the Cyberdemons TP in closer to the end of the fight, they're on a timer, and they have a dual purpose, which is they're creating even more pressure because it's the end of the fight. I want to pressure the player even more. It's also forcing them to utilize the cover in the fight because if they kill the Vial straight away, then the cover is less important because Hell Knight and Baron Fireballs are pretty easy to dodge overall in open areas. So there's that, and then the other main purpose that they serve is to speed the fight up because they will clear out the Hell Knights and Barons for you. So they're helpful if you know how to utilize them for infighting, but they're also dangerous if you don't utilize them correctly. So um, each of these monster types is put into this arena for a specific reason. I'm never just building a room, building a teleport closet, and I'm like, well, I haven't used any Cacodemons. Let's make a Cacodemons. Because, like, Cacodemons in this space would be completely brainless gameplay because you would just rocket them down. There'd be very little pressure. Yeah. So try to think about that in more detail when you're building encounters. Okay, so yeah, in this case, because like if you have an aesthetic arena, like it's just an arena built for aesthetics, you haven't really thought about combat. You can always add shit in after the fact, right? You want some vials, you can add some pillars, maybe some pillars that raise up out of the ground, uh, something like that. In this particular case, I I added in, I believe I added in one podium. Oh, not podium, sorry. I added in one extra piece of cover, so I believe this wasn't here initially. I added this in, so I could hide some ammo behind it. Also, if you get fucked on the vial, like you run over to kill him, you get like a 5 rocket vial or something, and you get really screwed. You know, there's still some cover. There's cover from the bridge here, from vial blasts, and there's cover here too, right? That's also why this was extended up instead of being a smaller one, so that you had a little bit of cover here, so you could finish him with SSG maybe. Um, so there were like a couple of little tweaks to the arena after the fact, once I had the monsters in place, as well as like these little podiums being raised for the ammo, so that if you don't know vials, you can actually block. They shoot 2 projectiles. You can actually block one of them that does the majority of the damage if you're behind a 32 object, a 32 high object. I'm not sure if it's exactly 32 high. It might be, there might be some variance there, and it'll reduce the damage of their blast down to 20 basically. So that's why these are sort of raised like this, just in case for the vial. Uh, and it might be the case, like I was talking about in that other area, you might start moving around your space and you put a lot of bumpy floors. Like this ended up not being too bad, but maybe you put like a lot of dips for like maybe you fucking have this kind of stuff, but it's like raised or lowered or something, and it's very bumpy. After the fact, you can kind of flatten that out or put fake floors on or something to make it a bit more sort of combat viable, which is obviously what you're looking to do when you're making encounters rather than just focusing on aesthetics alone. So yeah, always something to think about, and you know you can always fix those encounters afterwards. What are we up to? How to fine tune encounters. Okay. I talked about this a little bit, but let's get into it. So let's talk about incidental versus arena combat. So arena style lock-ins generally more focused set-piece encounters designed around specific monsters performing specific roles and often creating combat puzzles. So you know your Sunders, your Sunlusts, your Fraction Worlds, et al. Um, although you know Fraction Worlds and Sunlust both have mixtures of incidental and arena combat. So incidental placement focuses more on natural enemy placement designed around free-flowing combat. So this would be like, you know, original Doom and stuff. So if you're not familiar with those terms, it's generally the kind of thing people are talking about. So things to consider when making incidental stuff. Now, not 100% my forte. I definitely made incidental stuff in the past. Tomahawk is very much more incidental, although semi-set PC. And haste, my haste maps kind of fit into that category too. Uh, things that you need to think about. Sound propagation is way more important. So if we take a look at if we take a look at Tomahawk, for instance, we can see sound propagation. All this green means that the sound propagates around this entire map. The whole map is completely open. Now, not every incidental map is like this, obviously. You know, a lot of incidental maps, in fact, are, you know, there are a lot of doors and things like that that'll block sound. But generally speaking, a lot of incidental stuff has like these more open layouts. This map was specifically designed to be like a circuit that you could like run all the way through and around and get to every area very quickly. But what this means is that you have to take the way that sound travels into account a lot when you're making these kinds of incidental maps. Um, you know, there are some simple things to consider, obviously, like just setting monsters to ambush can help break the combat up a little bit, just to stop monsters from attacking the player all at once, and like following the monster around, or following the player around into areas you don't want them to go to and stuff. You should think about I guess you want to think about how the monsters are moving around the space, whether they're going to block the player from moving into other areas. How much do you want to like keep the flow going of the map? And yeah, flow in general is just more important when you're thinking about this kind of stuff, because you want monsters to be able to move around to cause pressure, uh, because the movement of the monsters and the way they route around the space is a lot more important in terms of creating pressure in incidental stuff usually than than in like arena lock-in scenarios where the player moves from space to space, and you fight in a space and then you move to a new space and you fight in that space. A lot of the time for incidental stuff where it's all pieced like one big map pieced together, you're gonna have monsters that TP in and follow the player to an area, and then you get blocked in a hallway, and then you gotta fight some stuff to get through, kind of thing. There's like in Tomahawk, you're gonna run into that a lot, where there are just monsters all over the place all the time, and a lot of the combat revolves around sort of managing those monsters and their pathing and the way they flow around the map and stuff. Um, yeah, thinking about monster placement before building areas and incidental stuff is even more important realistically for incidental stuff, in my opinion, because uh, if you're building your stuff to be free flowing, um, you're going to run into a lot of scenarios where it's very easy for the player to just run past your monsters. Uh, More so than in a map that's constructed around lock-ins. So this means that obviously like pre-planning out your areas on like how the monsters are going to path and route around is it's going to be even more useful for those scenarios, because you're going to have a much better understanding of how the monsters move around the space. You can also like break up your you can also sort of break up the combat by surprising the player with stuff like insta pops, lowering walls, changing the space, things like that. Because blocking player movement and surprising the player is an important way to slow them down and force them to engage in encounters to stop them simply leaving an area. I talked about sort of enforcing the gimmick with lock-ins, and with incidental maps where the player has a lot of freedom to kind of move around the space, you actually need to enforce combat itself. Like you need to find ways to make the player engage with the monsters in the space because especially better players, it's going to be their inclination to like, how do I get around these monsters so that I can herd as many monsters together as possible and then kill them efficiently. Uh, and if you're trying to mitigate that, uh, which you don't necessarily always want to do, sometimes that style of gameplay is actually really fun and can be a great way to build a map. But if you are trying to get the player to actually engage in the combat, then it's definitely something you're going to want to think about, is sort of utilizing different ways of introducing monsters into the space, rather than just having them placed around randomly or having them all teleport in, or you know, just following one set pattern for combat. So for arena style consideration, which I definitely have a little bit more of a handle on, firstly, one of the first things to think about is line of sight in a space. So can monsters shoot from across the room, or is there cover? Now, this is obviously different from monster to monster. Line of sight for a vial, uh, kind of a different beast from line of sight from a Hell Knight, for instance. And line of sight from different distances can mean different things. If you've got Hell Knights that are really far away in a really gigantic space, and they're throwing fireballs across the room, you got to think about, okay, like when does the threat of the attack actually occur in the fight, and how can the player play around that and stuff. If there's like a massive wave of fireballs that's coming at the player, but because the space is so big, they have to wait for those fireballs to come, that's very different from Hell Knights that are close to the player that they have to dodge kind of immediately, kind of thing. So there's line of sight, and there's also like the distance and range for monsters. And this also plays into like, can I utilize hit scan in this space? Is there enough line of sight that I can actually utilize hit scan that's going to feel fair to the player, or is it like a big open space and they're just going to get shredded, kind of thing? How does each individual monster type move around the arena? This is really fucking important, and people need to think about this more, I think. And this definitely plays into the thinking, like pre-planning combat as opposed to just building a circle and then putting stuff in after the fact. You got to think about stuff like pinkies. They really struggle with stairs. Arachnotrods and manx can't get into small areas. Remnants and archfights can follow the player almost anywhere. Remnants and archfights are very easy to use because, well, they're very easy to use generally speaking, not necessarily well, but they're easy to place down and have them work in a space because they can follow the player pretty much anywhere. They're about the same height as the player. They're both 56, I believe, even though their models are larger. And they're also the same width as the player. So they follow the player pretty much anywhere. Well, they're not the same width as the player. They're a bit bigger, but they can fit into 64 gaps regardless, which is generally the size people build for, like, this is how big the player is, even though he's 32, but whatever. So yeah, you really need to think about that stuff. You can't just put, you know, a mastermind into a space that he can't walk around in, because he's going to be even more useless than he usually is, which is to say, completely useless. Cyber demons, you know, they need a certain height of step to get down. They also need a room of 110 or higher. Usually people just go with 128 to be safe. Things like that. Yeah, where does the player start in the arena? So I talked about that earlier with the other one. How does this influence monster movement in the space? If the player begins in the safest place in the arena, then what incentive is there for them to move from safety? Always think about what is the safest place in the arena when you're designing an encounter. And always think about, if this is the safest place in the arena, can the player stay here for long, or are they actually being pressured to leave that space? The interesting thing about Doom combat is having to carve out a safe space as a player. That's usually what a lot of sort of slaughter stuff entails. Like that's what you're attempting to do, and you can get there through, like, you know, a variety of different means. But generally speaking, you don't ever want to just have the players start in the safest place, and for the whole fight they can stay in the safest place. There always should be some incentive to kind of pressure them away from that. Are perch monsters viable? Are they too strong or are they too weak? Yeah, so, you know, Vile on a platform in the middle of an arena with no cover, he's going to be pretty strong, you know. But if you've got hit scanners in 64 boxes in the walls, and there's cover everywhere, and they could never get line of sight at you long enough to shoot you, then not particularly viable, right? And that's something that, will become more apparent as you sort of build, or rather can be thought about more easily if you're sort of considering monster placement before constructing an arena. Anyway, also thinking about heights and stuff for purge monsters. Are they too high for the player to see from certain angles? Every time I build a space, aesthetically speaking, and for encounter purposes, I check every single angle of a room. So what has line of sight of me at this point of the room, and in this point of the room, and in this point of the room? Is this a safe space? Is this a cheesable area, etc.? Yeah. Where the main source of pressure for the player, this is probably the biggest one. People tend to know a little bit about pressure, even if they're sort of newer mappers. But yeah, chances are if you only have one source of pressure, the player can likely cheese the area with one safe spot. If there are too many, then the fight can feel messy. Yeah, so, uh, if it's just the fight starts and there are 10 Cacodemons ahead of you and you have a rocket launcher, there's no pressure, right? You just dodge left to right, shoot the Cacos, very easy. If suddenly you introduce a pain elemental behind you to the left and right, and there are 10 Cacodemons in front of you, and you have a rocket launcher, okay, well shit, I have to deal with the pain elementals first. They're on my flanks on either side. So I 100% have to deal with that threat first. This gives the Cacodemons time to move towards the player. Suddenly they can surround the player, body block the player. Suddenly the fight's way more interesting, right? Just by adding a couple of extra little pressure points. But if I have 5 pain elementals in front of me and 8 pain elementals behind me in all directions, and I have a rocket launcher, suddenly there are too many points of pressure for the player to realistically be able to deal with, most likely. So I guess try to create these points of pressure intelligently so that there's sort of some ability for the player to make intelligent decisions, which I think should realistically, if you're making like arena style combat, that should be your goal, is like think about whether or not the player can make intelligent decisions during the fight. And that should generally lead to interesting combat, in my opinion. Also, where are the arena's main bottlenecks and how easy are they to utilize for cheese? Sometimes bottlenecks can be used as like actually part of combat in an interesting way. If you think about map 25 of Sunlust, which you might not know off the top of your head, but there's a big Cacodemon swarm that's pressuring you with a Cyberdemon. You have to kill the Cacodemons as quickly as possible because there's a lowering wall. And revenants start to pour out from behind that wall. So if you there's like a hallway and a little wall that's lowering, right? So if you kill the Cacodemons quickly enough, you can actually bottleneck the revenants. Like you can Argent core them in this tiny hallway and just rocket them all to death. And the threat level's like really low, right? But if you kill the Cacodemons too slowly, they start to pour into the arena, and then you've got to sort of use strafe, and then they fill the arena, and then you get overwhelmed, and then you're fucked, basically. Uh, but having the bottleneck there is a reward for killing the Cacodemons quickly enough, right? So there are ways to allow for sort of cheese and stuff, or easy ways to handle sections of fights that are still rewarding, right? Because you're like, well, shit, I killed those Cacodemons so quickly. Now I get to kill these revenants really easily. And that's still an interesting way to design an encounter. There's like risk and reward and, all the elements that make gameplay fun. But if you have, too many bottlenecks and it's just completely trivializing a fight, doorways in particular, big problem for this kind of thing. Usually in sort of incidental style maps, you have a lot of doorways that create these bottlenecks where you can just stand in a doorway or let monsters funnel their way through a doorway and kill stuff very easily. Yeah, just try to think about bottlenecks as something to consider when designing an encounter anyway. Okay, so I think this will be sort of the last little segment. Maybe there's some other garbage at the end. So taking an existing encounter and iterating on it, how to make a concept you like, take a concept you like, and make it into something unique to your map. Also known as how to steal fights from other WODs. And get away with it, question mark? Not anymore, because I'm telling you what I stole. Alright. So why are you taking the encounter in the first place? What's interesting about the fight? Visually, conceptually, combat-wise, what can I do to improve the fight? So, what's interesting about the fight to you, I suppose? What are you personally trying to do? Because that's going to be like the bit you want to elevate out of the fight. And I guess like what works in the original and what doesn't, and then how can I improve it by either eliminating these parts you don't like or sort of elevating them. And then is the fight actually being iterated on, or am I just stealing it? I would like to think that if you're going to take an encounter, you're going to try to make it your own, right? It's like covering a song. You don't really just want to do it in exactly the same way. And you never fucking copy paste stuff from other people's maps, obviously. Big no-no. So, final fight of Electric Winds, map 3 of Fractured World. So we were already on it for the other encounter, but let's go back. Have a look at what I stole. Okay. So... so basically, this fight in Fractured Worlds... the final fight of Fractured Worlds here, this area is basically just a rip-off of Darkwave 32. There's an encounter in that utilizes the same fight concept, which is basically like you walk to this and it teleports you here, but exactly here. So like if I move here, it teleports me like straight ahead. And you get teleported straight ahead on all of these and back the other way, right? That's how the fight works. There are Cyber Demons here, a bunch of Hell Knights here, etc. So the whole concept is like messing around with like player movement and like the visual elements of player movement. Like you're kind of making the player have to think about how they move in a different way, right? Because if I want to dodge a Cyber Demon that's ahead of me like this, to get around him, I gotta teleport to here, and then he might stay here. I could teleport back. You know, there's like your movement becomes like a totally different thing, and you have to process kind of combat a different way, which is what makes it really interesting. So, started with this concept, and I basically just scaled it up and made it sort of more visually striking. Actually, let me just open up Darkwave 32. And I'll show you what I stole for full transparency. So, this is Darkwave 32. And here is the area that I stole, basically. You teleport across these things. These are the teleporters here. You can see, represented by the conch blue. And you know, you have your Cyber Demon here, and there's like some Hell Knights that TP in. So it's the same concept, right? Essentially, as the fight that I have at the end. But it's much smaller, much more contained. Gimmicks much less sort of pressed. And yeah, so when I was talking about what works and what doesn't, initially I wanted to sort of tackle the 3D nature of the original with the monsters below you, but it actually completely screwed up the flow of the combat, so I ended up removing it. And this was sort of an important part of figuring out, like, why did it work in the original but not in my version? So, in the original version, you can see that, like, this is sort of the teleporter thing. Like, this is the bit that I took out. and you can see that it's built into the center of the map. So the map actually flows like around and like through it. So the 3D nature of the map is actually like already pre-constructed because it's built in. Whereas my version of the fight is kind of built off to the side by virtue of how my map flows. So this meant for the Darkwave fight, it was like really natural for the 3D element to come in. And by the 3D element, I mean there are monsters below you here. This area gets like filled up with monsters, and you can like teleport over, quote unquote, over the top of them, right? So it feels like it's like three-dimensional, I suppose. But for me, it really came down to like boiling the fight down to like what the most interesting aspect of it is, which is the movement on the teleporters, right? And then visually, I sort of just amped it up in my own way aesthetically with like lighting sequences and some other stuff. And trying to implement that 3D element, because originally I had like, yeah, here you can see. Originally I had the idea of having several lanes of monsters that would come from behind as the teleport mess was occurring in the main area. So the idea was, let me just open this up again. Oh, okay. Thought Doom Builder was gonna crash. So, uh, yeah, originally I was gonna have these be like lanes of monsters that would come through at the same time. So monsters would actually be coming like down these and around. Up there were stairs here, and they were gonna come up the stairs behind you while you were like doing the teleport element of this fight. And that was just so that I could have that visual 3D sort of thing of you teleporting over them and stuff. But it ended up being like a real shitty mess because like you were getting hit as you were teleporting, and the monsters like they weren't really flowing because of the way player movement is in this space. You were going back and forth and stuff. So, it just didn't really work out very well in the end. And it's important to kind of, if you're taking a fight like this, like focus on like the sort of main foundation that you enjoy, and don't try to like overcomplicate it, because like just because you're making it bigger and more complex doesn't necessarily mean you're actually making it better. Uh, um, but yeah, so what I did to sort of quote unquote improve it, or like make the fight my own, was to make the space sort of larger and enforce the gimmick a little bit more. So I'm enforcing this sort of TP movement by having the space being like um, there's like way more pressure from the cybers, way more pressure from the Hell Knights, so you have to utilize this sort of TP mechanic to move around the fight and like keep yourself alive. You have to go from one end of the arena to the other and then like loop around and dodge through and stuff. So because I love the gimmick of it so much and like the visual uh, elements of it so much, enforcing that gimmick was like the primary thing that I wanted to do. So yeah, basically, if you're gonna take a fight, make sure you iterate on it. Don't overcomplicate it. Focus on what's interesting about it, and then try to strip out the things that you thought didn't work as well, perhaps. So, some other final thoughts. Try to avoid using too many doors, uh, as they often lead to stagnant gameplay and door camping. This is like the bottleneck discussion I was talking about earlier. Uh, If working out monster placement before geometry feels like a chore, at least place monsters in the space at several points during designing an area in order to see how they move around the space. This helps a great deal in understanding the focal points of your space and the way line of sight monster aggro functions in the area. So, to boil this down, just try to think about monster placement as you're building, at least a little bit. And placing monsters down, like, if you just have an arena, you're like, I don't really know what I want to do with this area. I don't know what monsters I want to use it at. Just put monsters in. Be like, what monsters do you feel like might work in the space? And then just like put some Manx down, some Hell Knights, whatever. Enter the game, like test, go into test mode, and just run around with a super shotgun and shoot the Manx in the space or whatever. Feel how they move around, and feel like how they pressure you and stuff like that. And then if they don't work, try different monsters. It's a really good way to get like a basic understanding of what might be fun. Um, Consider building monster reveals into your maps rather than entirely relying on teleporters to introduce monsters, especially pertinent for GZ people who are sort of getting into mapping and using ACS and stuff. Don't rely too much on like map spots and using ACS to TP stuff in. Try to build stuff into the space to add some depth. It really helps make a space feel more alive, I think. As a final thought, try to mitigate luck for players, mostly so you don't have to hear about your map, how your map is RNG when they get owned. Like the amount of fucking times I have to listen to people say that like a fight is total RNG when I've like worked really hard to like mitigate luck out of fights. Sometimes my fights are bullshit RNG, okay? Entropy definitely had some bullshit RNG in it, but later down the line, for the most part, no. So this is going to mean avoiding rooming floor vials in large-scale encounters. Entropy Final Fight, for instance, forehead with low cover or never using shotgunners because they pop you for 45 damage out of nowhere. And he's Madge. Yeah, this is why shotgunners are often avoided in like slaughter stuff because they do so much damage instantly, very hard to avoid. So yeah, I guess when designing encounters, I'm not actually saying don't use shotgunners. I use them now and then, but just be careful with not. I'm not saying don't make difficult stuff because people will complain about it being like luck, but there are definitely ways to mitigate luck being a factor in encounters. So it's definitely something to consider. Anyway, this video ended up being very long. I think it's like an hour and a half or something. But I guess I will see what people think about the video, and then if it's if it's something people are interested in, I might do a couple of other videos, probably shorter ones, on some other topics. I just saw a lot of people talking about this and how thing placement was like such a massive chore, and I thought maybe it might be interesting to hear the perspective of someone who's like done a decent amount of mapping and definitely thought about this stuff maybe a little too much at times. It might be interesting to hear some thoughts about it, and it might help some people like to hear some good ways to sort of mitigate that horrible feeling of having to deal with thing placement after the fact all the time. And the key is don't deal with it after the fact. Think about monster placement the entire time you're mapping. That is really the best way to deal with it. As a TLDR of the whole cool Google slideshow. But anyway, thank you for watching. Might try and do some more YouTube content, like I said, because streaming is a bit of a struggle at the moment, but this is something I can maybe do. And it'll probably be varying content, not necessarily big long-winded videos like this, but yeah. If it's something you're interested in, let me know, and yeah, I'll catch you next time. Maybe. Okay, goodbye.